So I can now say I have read enough nonfiction to fill one hand. Yes, I feel like I am a veteran of the nonfiction genre now. Not even close. But I can fill every finger on one hand that I've read with a nonfiction book that I've read. And that does feel good. I've read some good ones. So, the big question, was this a good one? Stick around. Welcome back to Kevin Toll Reads. I hope you're doing well. I am here with a book review of Mary Beard's Emperor of Rome, published in 2023. Mary Beard, Cambridge professor, writes an article. I believe it is in the Times Literary Supplement as a kind of a classics piece. I found that on the internet, and so I thought that was interesting. But I read this book as part of, I read this book because of Bob over at Robert G. Reader Books. He's doing kind of a Roman challenge where he challenged people to read more about Rome and Roman emperors. And I thought, hey, this sounds like something up my alley. When it comes to nonfiction books, really I have a couple things I'm looking for. And the first and foremost is I want the subject matter to be interesting. Otherwise, obviously, you don't want to read non-interesting books. But I want it to read not like a textbook, and this doesn't. I've been blessed with the 5 or 6 books that now I've read that are nonfiction, that most of them don't read like that. I thought Jack Miles, who wrote God, an autobiography, I thought that one read a little kind of like a textbook, a little bit, but the others, Mary Roach, Nathaniel Philbrick, Mary Beard, all of these they've read very, very well. I also, when it comes to nonfiction, I want to learn little tidbits, fun, interesting facts. I'm always interested in those little bitty things, and so I like to hone in on those. And there's a plethora in here when it comes to this. So, what's this book about? Well, Mary Beard takes a look at, the cliche of emperors, whether they're tyrannical, they're enlightened, how they performed, their power over governance, how emperors rule, how they can be immensely powerful if they rule in the right way, and what is that way and what's right. And so there's a lot of different aspects and avenues that she navigates. I think how the structure of this book works really well is we go from talking about just all the various aspects. We don't get really into the weeds too much on any one thing. And I think that really helps make it work very, very well. Each chapter has, a premise, an overarching premise, but in there it's kind of like almost like we're going to talk about these individual things under that subject matter. And I think that works really, really well. Almost, I wouldn't say outline form, but it works really, really well. So when we're talking Rome and emperors, and I'm definitely not a scholar when it comes to this, what I also appreciated from Beard in this book was we're not covering hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we're really talking about 25, 30 emperors. And so I appreciated that. And we've got a nice selection because we go from some really, really bad, just not nice people to, some people that you could argue were good for the Rome and the Republic and whatnot. And so let's talk about what I liked and some of the highlights here. So obviously we got some great emperors and some not so great emperors. We have Augustus, the first emperor, who kind of turned Rome into a republic, from a republic into a monarchy, I guess I should say, without really, meaning to, and that could be argued, I guess. Bob could probably correct me because he's definitely more scholarly than I am when it comes to this. You go from Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. I think Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius probably were the two that I kind of hone in on as probably good for the overarching, people and the Republic and, the history. But, obviously Marcus Aurelius, his philosophies, his writings are still, talked about, studied, applicable in various forms. And so I found those all really interesting. But the main thing that I thought was really, really good was some of the tidbits. And that's really what I was really honed in on is let's talk about some of the good and the bad. And so when it came to these emperors, you have lots of different, let me adjust the camera here. Excuse me. You have lots of different emperors talking about various things. You in doing various things. So you have very, very young emperors, you have older, more mature emperors, and it's definite, and it doesn't always translate, and their actions are going to be better or worse. But you definitely get to see personalities come through in some of their vanity, some of their actions, how they thumb people, how they prove their power and whatnot. So we have emperors that are very gluttonous. We have emperors that are, that have sexual choices that are questionable, even in today's standards. You have emperors that, would be very gluttonous. You had, with their food choices, you had, paranoia with wine tasters and people that would then taste everything, for fear of poison. You have a lot of backstabbing. You have emperors that were very tyrannical. And so some of the tidbits I really liked. So there was one emperor. So Beard talks a little bit about, how you address an emperor, how you meet an emperor, and what, you can or you should or should not do, and how it could be deemed, how the emperor addresses you and wants you to kiss his ring or kiss his feet, and what that could mean from a standpoint of the unsaid. You had one emperor that was walking along and said to another person that he recognized, and the person said, "Hello, Caesar," and he said, "Goodbye, so-and-so," and that person knew that he had to walk home and kill himself. Just by saying, just by the emperor saying goodbye and passing. And so I find that very fascinating. I thought that was really interesting. I really enjoyed the talk about the feasts. You had one emperor or they talked about, preparing food. And one emperor, they were talking about they would prepare multiple pigs, and so they would stagger the start times of cooking these pigs over a course of hours, because they wanted it, when the emperor decided it was time to feast, they wanted a pig to be fresh and hot. And so the others were just, I don't know if they're discarded or what, but the gluttony, when you compare to what the people had to eat, was just mind-boggling. Obviously, you had one emperor that really liked to overstress his power, and so he would bring people in to wine and dine them, and then during the course of the meal would excuse himself and take wives of the guests that he invited to go back and sleep with them, only to come back to the feast and make fun of the wives and their husbands in front of everyone, just to prove his power. I'm like, wow. Yeah. But probably the main thing that I really, really enjoyed was the discussion around the Colosseum. Obviously the gladiator aspect of it was really interesting. Commodus is talked about. There's the rumor or the theory that his mother slept with a gladiator, and that is why Commodus had an affinity towards the games in the Colosseum. He would actually had a place where he would stay down below in the barracks, so to speak, with the other gladiators. He participated in the pre-show of the gladiator games from a safe, environment, but felt like he was part of it. And that was really interesting. But the main interesting aspect was the Colosseum itself, because the Colosseum is what is touted. When you think of Rome, people think Colosseum. What I found interesting was the Coliseum, it seats roughly 50, 60,000 was estimated. And so that's massive, especially during that time. But what is not talked about or is well known, at least in my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, was the Maximus Circus, which it would actually seat or house like 250,000 people, which is double with the size of any football stadium we have today. And it is just not well known or widely talked about, at least again in my perspective. And I found that very, very fascinating. Um, Obviously there's a lot of, excerpts. There's a lot of great little tidbits, and that's what I'm looking for in a nonfiction book, which is why I kind of enjoyed this. I don't always rate nonfiction books, but if I had to give this a rating, I'd probably say it's a 4.2. Definitely worth your time if you're a nonfiction reader, or if you're just a Roman or a history buff and looking for your next read. Definitely one you should check out. I'm really glad I did, and I can say that with probably almost every nonfiction book, even though it's 5 or 6 now, that I'm glad I read it because I learned something, and that's really what I'm looking for when it comes to nonfiction. I'm definitely not looking to be so much entertained as I am looking to learn little tidbits that are just nice to know. So I really enjoyed this. I'm glad I read it. Thanks again to Bob for his Roman challenge that is continuing. And you definitely need to check out Bob's channel. He has a couple different updates regarding this. He's a great guy. I love his channel. And I'm glad I read this. Mary Beard, Emperor of Rome. I give it a 4.2. Another nonfiction book under my belt. I'm a nonfiction master now. Not even close. But I'm glad I read this. It was well worth my time. I'm sorry it took so dang long. If you followed me on the channel talking about this took several months to get through. Not because of the writing, just because of everything else. But that's my take. Emperor of Rome, Mary Beard, 4.2, another nonfiction book. Hope you have a great rest of your day and you enjoy this kind of unedited, raw book review. I'll talk to you all later. Thanks.